In this video, we'll be reviewing a hand from the WPT Main Event in the UK. We are 9-handed with all players in the money and 330k up top.
Doing something very odd, which is difficult to know. Very often you don't know your opponent's strategy, so you just have to use your good, fundamentally sound default strategy, which is to go all in.
Ryan will raise ace-4 suited here. Maria, 10-9 in the big blind. This wants to make sure she knows how much she's playing against. And she will make a call. And on 10-8-4 all diamonds, Maria will outflop Ryan here, but a board that both players likely to be cautious on. Maria checks over to Ryan. Ryan with a hand that can find reasons for both betting and checking.
Yeah, if you bet, you just get lots of hands with equity to fold or put in money, which is fine either way, that you beat.
Ryan Mandera opens under the gun +2 with ace-4 of clubs, and Maria Lampropoulos calls in the big blind with 10-9 off, both of which are standard plays from a GTO perspective with the ante. The flop comes 4-8-10 all diamonds. Maria checks and Ryan c-bets 44% of pot. Interestingly, the solver is betting virtually 100% of its range in this spot, mixing its sizings between 25% and 44% of pot. However, if we examine the EV differences between the alternative possible strategies, including checking, we see that the EVs are all very close. And when the EVs of betting and checking are close, this usually means the solver will play more of a mixed strategy between the two actions, but this appears to have been altered by ICM. If we remove ICM considerations, we see that the solver does significantly more checking on this board with its entire range, while at the same time favoring a larger sizing, but again, we see the EVs being relatively close among all the different strategies. So why is that? Well, monotone flops are unique since both players typically will have a number of made flushes in their range, which immediately elevates the equity of a significant number of combos, which would otherwise be of low value on a rainbow board. This in turn mitigates, to a certain extent, the range advantage the preflop aggressor carries under normal circumstances. Right, if we rerun the sim with all the same variables but change the board from monotone to a rainbow, we see that the betting increases significantly, both in terms of frequency and sizing, as we see that the solver now overwhelmingly favors the larger full pot sizing against the big blind's very wide defending range. And if we compare the equities of Ryan's range between the two different flops, but filter out combos holding a diamond on the monotone flop, we see that the flushes produced by the monotone flop essentially cram down the equities of the entire rest of the range. Right, pretty much every single combo in the range loses 10% or more in equity on the monotone flop compared to the rainbow flop, including overpairs, sets, ace highs, and total junk. So what does this mean as a practical matter? Well, on a monotone board, typically the preflop aggressor will still retain its range advantage, since both players should have a proportionally similar number of flushes in their range, but the monotone flop will generally dampen aggression overall, because hands that would otherwise be very strong on most boards, such as top pairs, two pairs, and sets, are now way behind a relatively large number of made flushes in the opponent's range. Right, when it comes to flushes, the fact that the preflop caller generally will have fewer strong aces in its range is not really relevant, since any ace-x combo of the same suit is now the nuts, since the kicker is irrelevant. On the other hand, a monotone board automatically should afford the preflop raiser more opportunities to bluff a greater portion of its range due to the amount of flushes he should have. Right, we have previously discussed how our bluffs should generally mirror our value combos in terms of both frequencies and sizings. A monotone board allows us to leverage the flushes in our range to bet with combos that the solver typically would prefer to play more passively or give up with on other boards. This is particularly true since any c-bet will force our opponent to fold a significant portion of its range on this dangerous board, especially with respect to holdings that do not contain a diamond. Given that a monotone flop often mitigates range advantage, but at the same time affords us with a wider array of bluffs, the ultimate end result is that you will often see the solver playing a mixed strategy in the shoes of the player with the overall range advantage, where the EV differences between checking and betting small, and sometimes even betting larger sizings, will be relatively close for the entire range. If we take a look at a bunch of different monotone flops in a button versus big blind scenario in a cash game, we see that regardless of which combo we examine, the EV difference between checking and betting third pot will almost always be very close. Even hands that you would typically think should be checked back with high frequency, such as underpairs and strong aces, are generally okay to bet. And hands that typically should want to bet larger, such as top pairs, sets, and lower overpairs, are generally okay to check. In contrast, on the rainbow board, we see that if we compare the EVs between checking and betting small, the solver strongly prefers betting these lower overpairs as well as bottom sets, and we lose significant EV if we instead check back.
And, checking has a lot of merit because if you bet and get called, well, now it's not so great because you're either against a better hand or a draw that has plenty of equity against you. So what do you like in this spot?
If I bet very small. So my only real note here is I think Ryan may have bet a little bigger than needed.
Maria calls, which we see as the standard play here, as the solver is doing virtually no raising with its range with ICM in play. And even when we remove ICM, we see that the solver still does very little raising. The reasoning, I think, is based on the same principle we discussed with respect to the preflop raiser. The monotone flop appears to have dampened aggression for the preflop caller as well, since raising in this spot doesn't serve much purpose for a good portion of her range. Right, if you have a flush, you don't really need much protection, and if you raise, you force your opponent to fold many of his weaker holdings, and you may end up being called primarily by hands that have you beat, such as better flushes. And if you don't have a flush but a stronger holding such as a set, raising is a risky proposition since your opponent should have a number of flushes in his range that you may run into. If we compare the check raising strategy on the rainbow board, we see that it increases significantly. And if we take a look back at our 184 flops and sort by check raising frequency, we see that most of the spots that are check raised with very low frequency are on monotone boards. Even on boards where you would generally expect a greater amount of check raising, such as this 6-4-3 board, is only being check raised around 9% of the time when all the cards on the flop are of the same suit. And we see that the big blind will check raise up to 25% of its range on certain other boards, but none of these boards with higher check raise frequency are monotone.
Bigger than needed. But his 150 does get a call from Maria, and a 3 of clubs lands on the turn. I think
it's worth mentioning. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think at a final table, I lean towards betting and assuming that Maria is going to check raise less often than usual with, random one diamond hands that occasionally mix in a bluff check raise. And yeah, that she's just going to play slightly more cautious in this spot, and so betting clears out some equity on her behalf. And look at this. Ryan going to double barrel here. This is surprising.
The turn brings the 3 of spades, which is pretty much a blank, and Ryan continues, this time with a 56% pot bet. Here we see that the solver prefers checking this hand. This paired 4 is a marginal made hand that has showdown value but is not very strong, so you don't necessarily want to bloat the pot, particularly when we consider how many flushes the big blind should have in its range, since with an ante, virtually 100% of suited combos should have called preflop.
So we bet about half pot. It's an interesting size because, I suppose you make some random hands like Queen Jack with a diamond fold, maybe? Or King Queen with a diamond? We still have to think any 10 or 8 will call you. So maybe he's planning on triple barreling.
I think he can get some 8s to fold in this context. Not many, but some. 10s, pretty much never. And so Maria does make the call here.
Maria calls again, which we see is consistent with Pio, but this is becoming a much closer decision as we see the solver start to fold some weaker top pairs to the second barrel. As Ryan is in early position, his range should be relatively strong, so not only should he have a number of flushes here which crush top pair, but he should also have a number of overpairs, sets, and stronger top pairs as well.
And if I'm Ryan, I believe I would rather bluff a hand with more equity. I mean, almost certainly probably with a diamond in my hand. And a 10 of spades on the river will give Maria trips.
And you often like bluffing hands that can't win at the showdown.
Right.
Like Queen Jack, right? Queen Jack with a diamond, or random overcards with a diamond would be, I think, better bluffs than this hand. Unless you think that for some reason Maria would raise her pairs on the flop. I mean, again, like it seems like if you want to be betting, it's because you think your opponent does something, right or wrong, right?
Look at this. Maria's going to lead out on this 10 for 400,000.
The river brings the 10 of spades, and Maria steals the initiative and leads out with a small 30% pot bet. Interestingly, we do see that the solver favors the donk in Maria's shoes in both the ICM and non-ICM games. This is likely in part because Maria should have a number of 10s in her range which would have taken her line. If we take a look at the hotness chart, we see that both a paired 10 or 8 on the river provide the greatest EV for the out-of-position player, which justifies the donk. However, we see that although the solver increases its donking frequency with an 8 or 10, it is also donking with decent frequency on most other cards as well, even ones that in theory favor the preflop aggressor. So why is that? Well, this apparent block bet may in part be a result of the polarized board, which now creates a number of flushes as well as full houses in both players' ranges. When a board in and of itself is polarizing on the river, the solver will often choose to make a small donk bet out of position, including with its stronger holdings, since larger bets should cause the villain to fold most of its inferior hands and mostly call with nuttish holdings that we may be behind. This is in contrast to when the villain has a more condensed range, which has a greater percentage of middle strength hands that we are ahead of that can withstand a larger bet. Taking a look at Ryan's equity, we see that most of his range is green, meaning very strong, or red/orange, meaning very weak, and he only has a few combos of medium strength hands represented in yellow, primarily consisting of overpairs. And when GTO provides for smaller bets with our stronger holdings, this in turn provides cover to make a small block bet with a greater portion of our medium strength and weaker holdings, since the spectrum of our range is now disguised. For our medium strength hands, block betting allows us to set the price to continue, while at the same time deterring our opponent from attempting to bluff us off our equity. Additionally, a small block bet can also serve to obtain value from certain of the villain's marginal hands that act as bluff catchers. And for our weaker hands, we can also leverage the strongest portions of our range to fold out some of the villain's hands that may be ahead of us, which might otherwise call a small bet on a drier board. In this case, although trips in a vacuum is a strong hand, it is crushed by a number of holdings in Ryan's range, and therefore shouldn't want to bet huge in this spot with high frequency. However, on the other hand, checking is also somewhat risky, since if Ryan then decided to bluff large, Maria would then be forced to fold her trips with some frequency. As we can see, if Maria decided to check and Ryan bet 2/3 pot, we see that the GTO strategy when ICM is in play starts folding some of the trip 10s in Maria's range, given the dangerous board and Ryan's triple barrel. Right overpairs generally should not be triple barreling large on this type of board.
Monotone flops are very tricky situations and ones that I think people are less experienced at playing out. I am very curious what a solver would say about this river lead here. It's an interesting play.
Ryan folds, and we see that the solver is mostly calling or even raising with his hand facing the small block bet, but both are very low EV plays with or without ICM considerations. And this shows one of the risks of the small block bet, as it will often induce a raise. And we see that this counter strategy is even more pronounced when ICM is not in play, as the ICM pressure appears to generally cause the in-position player to play a bit more conservatively overall, for example by simply flatting with most of its flushes on the paired board. So in this video we analyze one of the trickiest boards to navigate, which is the monotone flop. Since the monotone flop elevates the equity of a significant portion of each player's range, which would otherwise be junk, the end result will often be that the solver will do a lot of mixing with its entire range. Typically stronger holdings such as top pair, two pair, and sets are somewhat diminished in value, while at the same time, a monotone flop will generally allow a greater variety of bluffing with weak and marginal hands. So that's the video for today. Until next time, stay balanced.